Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for coming along this afternoon. The topic of this conversation is going to be entity. So we have an amazing panel, as I mentioned, of about 20 people that have various interests in entities. Obviously, that's a very broad topic, so I know this conversation is going to be very interesting. How it's going to work is I'm going to do my little preamble now, trying to keep it to a minimum. We're not going to do introductions of all the panelists, but I've included links to their websites and information about them on my website. And I'll post comments in the chat as well, so keep the chat box open and you can also chat there. And this session is going to be recorded, and I will share the link where it's going to be on my YouTube channel. And the subject of entity, one thing I wanted to sort of start the ball rolling is just how kind of consistent the idea of entities is in human history and in human life as well. And where I wanted to start it off, because I'm not sure how many people are going to talk about this subject with regards to their own research, but I'm interested in the ancient Egyptian idea of the ka as a spirit. And one of the ideas in Egyptian mythology is that the ka originates in the human placenta. And so in the womb, we have this very early experience of a presence. And the Egyptians conceived that this placenta was like a cosmic twin, a twin that was a protector of the developing fetus. So even this early on, there seems to be some appreciation of the fact that we are encountering entities on a daily basis throughout our lives. And then one of the other things that occurred to me, because when people talk of entities, they often think of something negative, but childhood imaginary friends are a very common form of entity. So I wanted to start off the conversation to see whether anyone had had an experience of having an imaginary friend as a child. Susan.
Yes, I did. I had a number of experiences in childhood. Some were quite frightening, but my earliest one that I remember that I feel that I had in some way helped to conjure, but I was a child, so I didn't realize what I was doing, was a little boy. He did feel like almost a twin, except he was completely blue like a little Smurf. And he was kind of a friend, especially when I felt lonely. We would hide behind, like, my mother had these huge curtains that we would go behind and hide, and we would speak our own little secret language, and we would travel places, and it all felt very surreal and dreamlike. And of course, as an adult now, I would question whether or not there was anything real outside of my what was going on in my mind. Other than as an adult, I've also had experiences with entity that I may have had a hand in conjuring, but feel very real and as part of, in some ways, the reality that I am living now. So, yeah, that's it. Kind of started with that. And that was not a frightening experience. Although, as a child, I also had experiences with little imps or little beings that, yes, were very, very frightening at that time. And in fact, I do feel I conjured a dog or a wolf friend that was a protector as well in that childhood, that time frame growing up.
Thank you, Susan. That's interesting and brings me to this idea of poltergeists being like psychic projection from teenagers when there's a lot of emotional turmoil and they seem to manifest these entities that can often be very destructive. Kaz mentioned that she only has about half an hour for this call. So, Kaz, I know you have experiences of entities. Would you like to go next?
Hello, yes. So for me, it's mostly been in out of body experiences, mostly. My experience is that what you meet out there very much is on a par with the energy that you're putting out there. So when I was younger and I used to have these out of body experiences, I was really terrified of them and I was really in a negative place. And that is when I encountered many frightening entities. And later on in life, I discovered that I could avoid anything unpleasant just by having myself at a certain level of energy, let's say. And I remember putting a video out about this, and it caused me so much. I got such backlash for it, um, saying, people were asking me because people often said, are these entities that you encounter, are they real? And I would say, well, in a way, it doesn't really matter. That you have this experience of them. If you're in a particular energy, it matches you. Either they are real and they're attracted to your energy, or they're not real and somehow you're kind of creating it. But either way, it's easy to not encounter them, at least negative ones, just by simply being in a place of higher energy. And what I mean by that is not being frightened or being grateful or being positive or anything, anything that's let's say, it's a value judgment, what's higher and lower, but higher in that particular way. And yeah, so throughout my life, I've come across all kinds of things in the astral worlds and the out of body worlds, the whole spectrum. But I will say nowadays that is it's never negative. It's never negative anymore. And almost in a way, whatever is causing it is no longer something I even worry about. Like, it's all part of the big scheme of things. So yeah, that's my experience.
Great, thank you, Kaz.
You're
Now,
welcome.
Eyob, you mentioned you have to be off of the call by 7 as well, and it's not very often that you get to have someone who is an expert in ancient Ethiopian magic and entities. So I really want to hear what you have to say about that tradition.
Oh wow. It's a really long and broad one. What I can share is so from practitioners in Ethiopia, practitioners of healing, or if you want to call it magic, one of the most sort of high level of knowledge is being able to summon spirits. I don't want to say demon or devil. I don't want to put label to them. And there is an experience where some important practitioner who I knew his relative, um, talked about summoning this spirit for when he was in at apprentice stage, and it went wrong. It went completely wrong, and that story is always where he summoned. It was during auspicious time, night time, probably midnight, or and when you summon these beings or entities, in the Ethiopian tradition, we just learned, there's not much research, so it's very difficult to do things just by myself. But we found a really important manuscript that could be dated to the 13th century, which talks about different beings and entities that were created after man. So some could reside in water, some live above in caves. Very, really interesting text. But what you get from that text is to learn to respect these beings, these entities, and to learn also that they also have that they live in this cosmology. So in this particular story, which my grandma also was the witness, it went wrong for this person. Instead of being able to control what he saw, and in the traditional sense, it would, you would call up whatever you need to call up and ask questions or discuss, but you have to be a certain state of mind. But this person, for some reason, it went completely wrong, and he kept seeing it, and he was very frightening, and he ran off. Later on, he became a very important person, actually. So yeah, in Ethiopia, the most important thing is the cosmology, and every time you call up any call up any entity, you must have a reason. And also you must be able to understand what level they're at. So there are cases where it's gone really wrong, but there are positive cases where, again, this is another account of a very important figure, where they were able to summon guides, basically. Some would describe them as guardian angels, and they do appear on illustrations of scrolls as a protective figure. But yeah, it's not a direct experience, but it's something I've sort of heard about. But yeah, it's unresearched area. Thanks.
I remember when you did the presentation for Dream Palace Athens, you talked a little bit about Tsar rituals that you had been
Yeah.
witness to, and that kind of, does that carry over from more ancient Ethiopian traditions?
Yeah, so the Tsar, I mean, the Tsar, so-called Tsar cult, this is when a spirit takes you, and there's a lot of anthropological document on it. Very interesting. It's mostly associated with women, but having rituals, it was something that I've met people who've participated in this things, and basically when those kind of spirit resides on you, you're able to tell fortune. But again, most people, and I think this is like an ancient African tradition, there's a lot of respect associated, not so much, oh, they worship, because there's this stereotype, oh, they worship these things. No, it was more of really understanding people that have the Tsar upon them, which I've actually saw one person. And they do change. They become the carrier of the Tsar, so their attitude changes, and their surroundings. So there's a lot of rituals around it. And again, the Tsar is also practiced in Egypt, in Sudan, and I think in other parts of North Africa. But the category I was talking about was something really much more ancient, and apparently everything goes back to King Solomon in the Ethiopian tradition. That he was the first who was able to to control them or to summon them. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Eyob. That's wonderful. Myron, I know you had your hand up earlier, and I know you had childhood experiences of entities, so perhaps you can talk a little about that for us.
Well, yeah, I have more than childhood experiences, but if you remember from the past, I was in a coma when I was 4. And when I came out of the coma, I'd been in the coma for like 4 months. I didn't know my parents, I didn't know anyone, but there was an entity in the recovery room. And I immediately saw it and connected to it. And that entity has been with me my whole life. And I think that the idea of a dual personality or a projection or something that is not from me, but that has its own entity, its own life, its own experiences that I don't control, is certainly true in my spirit guide's existence. It does what it wants to do when it wants to do it. It teaches me things and what to do with those things and how to move forward. It has brought me through wars and death and visions that I have. I have temporal lobe epilepsy, so I have visions anyway. But she's actually partly responsible for all of my intersection with other beings besides her. There are beings of light, there are beings of dark, there are beings of transcendental existence that can't be explained rationally, or certainly no intellectualism is going to subjugate the ideas that these entities produce and talk to me about. And they've always been positive and correct. For instance, somehow Charon knows the future. Now, I don't know how people feel about that, but the fact is Charon knows the future, tells me what the future is going to be, and it's always been right. It's never been wrong. And I know that Jung talked about that in his Psychology and Alchemy, and also the Red Book. He had his own companion called Philemon, and Philemon and he would interface with each other, and they would write down information that was vouchsafed to both of them back and forth. Well, I get the same kind of messages from my spirit guides, and it started out as just one, and then it went to 12, and the 12 come when there is expansion necessary for my consciousness to move from one place to another, like, for instance, from here to, say, Orion, and which I can go instantaneously to. I know that probably sounds weird, but the fact is I've gone to a planet in Orion called Zelkon my whole life, ever since I was a child. Charon used to take me there all the time. And the 12 are part of that experience. So, not to bore people with this, but the fact is that I'll give you one example. I was in Saigon, and I was walking down the street, and I'd gotten off from my activity, and I was going to go to the bar and drink. And Charon stopped me and said, "No, go back to the barracks. Turn around and go back to the barracks." And I went, "Well, come on, I've been working for all these hours." And she said, "Turn around now and go back to the barracks." So I turned around, and the bar I was going to go to blew up and killed everybody in it. All the soldiers, all the girls, all the bartenders, they all died. So that kind of premonition or confirmation of information that comes from the entity is life-saving for me. It has saved my life as a child. It saved my life in numerous situations. Even when I climb mountains, and when I'm climbing, sometimes I'm making mistakes, and she'll correct me on those mistakes. So it's more than just an informative deity. It's like it's part of me, and it is me, but it isn't me. When this body leaves and is absorbed back into the light it came from, Charon, I don't know if Charon will be with that transition or not. She won't give me the answer to that because lots of times she doesn't give me answers until I'm ready for them. Now, even when things are going to be very, very, very hard, like I almost passed away about 3 months ago, she'll let me know what's coming, and I make preparations based on her input. And then I make art about it, of course. I'm an artist, and so I make art about it. You've seen the art, I'm sure. But anyway, not to bore people here, but the fact is that without Charon, I wouldn't be here talking to you. She has saved my life on many, many occasions. And the places that she takes me to, shamans have been going to for forever. I go to the most primitive caves on the planet, if they're even on this planet. And in those caves, vouchsafes back to me is information of other cultures like Ka and Ba. You mentioned Ka and Ba. I didn't know anything about Egyptology, and yet on the wall was written Ka and Ba. And I asked Karen, "What is that?" And she said, "You'll learn in time, you'll know." So she gives me that kind of information as well about other experiences and other cultures. So she's kind of a universal teacher of information. Now, If all of that is in my unconscious, which some people claim, Anthony doesn't claim that, but other people do, then that means that I'm really smart, or this information is there universally throughout the universe, throughout time. So time's not a relevant thing. Time is not linear. Time is now. So if I go into a cave and I see a cave painting, which I've done a lot of, that cave painting could be 50,000 years old, and it gives me the same energy as what my entities give me. I'll give you one example and then I'll shut up. I was in a museum in Vancouver, and they had all of these wonderful carvings of entities that the Eskimos had, and boats with animals, totems in them, and all that. And I was with my wife, and I was saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to spend some time here. I can't just walk past these things. I have got to internalize this energy. I cannot just go, oh, that's really interesting, and walk on. So I said, go have coffee somewhere, go do something. I'm going to spend 3 or 4 hours here. And I have to internalize these. The same thing happened to me when I was in China. I was at a Tibetan temple that the communists had allowed in Beijing. It's been there 700 years. And there are seven stages of Buddhism, of Tibetan Buddhism. And each building is one of those stages, and there's a carved entity that's 600 or 700 years old. It flattened me. That energy was so powerful. And so, I think that the energy that creates the entities is universal. And I don't think it's just restricted to this planet. And I don't think that it's restricted to anything. I think it has its own impetus, its own power. And if you open yourself to it, it'll come to you if you're open to it. If you're afraid of it, or you think it's a demon, or you think it's a negative thing, then you're going to manifest that comes from your ego. But if you let your ego get out of the way and let the entity teach you and interact with you, then your life will be enhanced. And I can't tell you the wonder and beauty. That word wonder is magical in itself. Just the wonder of this entity that has been with me my whole life is the most glorious thing I have ever experienced, period. So that's my story for now. But thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much. Yeah, Myron was a guest on Anthony Peake's Consciousness Hour, so that's how I've met Myron, and I can share that because we got a bit more in depth into his experiences. But it's amazing to have your perspective and learn more about your encounters. And if you want to see Myron's artwork, which features Charon and other entities, I can send you a link for Myron's website as well. Thank you so much. Danny, got a hand up. Thanks, Myron.
Sure.
Cheers. Okay, hi. Thank you for Myron. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask, is it Eyob? Am I saying that right?
Eyob.
Eyob.
Eyob, actually. Eyob, what is it?
Yeah, Eyob is yes, just phonetic. Yeah, Eyob or Eyob.
Okay,
Job.
Eyob.
Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm particularly interested in what happens when we don't feed the entities or we don't acknowledge them, but actually feed. Yeah, from that Ethiopian tradition, can you comment a little bit on what happens? And I'll just kind of open up what I'm talking about a little bit. I think what Kaz said right at the beginning, are they, so I'm asking, are they real? The word means isness. It's something that is, right? So whether they're real or not, it's a bit out the window, but they are, and they do seem to behave in a certain way. And there's tons and tons of folklore which says if you don't feed them, something goes badly wrong. And my experience in holding ceremonies and watching other people hold ceremonies, when you don't tend to the bellies of the spirits, then they take anyway. So I'm just wondering if you can illuminate that from your perspective.
Yeah, so I guess what's in the Ethiopian tradition, because don't forget it's conservative Christian country, especially Orthodox Christian, and then we have element of Judaism, Ethiopian Judaism, and Christian and Islam. And what you get with this three sort of religion is that they acknowledge such existence. They because I think it was especially there's an important month. If I remember, I think it's I know it in Ethiopia, I don't know. But it's through tradition. The beginning of that month is the month of the spirits. And I remember being, young, people would go and make noises of whips. And in fact, a lot of people, traditionally they say, if you have any dreams in that period, be careful because they tend to be odd dreams than any other month. So even they kind of become difficult for interpreters to interpret. And apparently it's because of the connection to those spirits. So whether they're real or not, I mean, I thought the word "real" in the Amharic language doesn't really exist. So when we say "real," what is this? A table is here. So I mean, it's either yeah, it doesn't exist. So English sometimes makes it difficult, but there is an acknowledgement of this tradition, and we do have like really important manuscript evidence of practitioners talking about them in their in their work. I guess sometimes you could also put angels in the same category, where I think that's probably more tolerated by the church and other religions, where people have had experiences of seeing angels. I mean, there's one recently which was on YouTube where he gives an account of an angel appearing, and he describes it as an angel, and he picks it up and he takes him to his farm and he gives him sets of commands to follow. Yeah, so I don't know if I've answered your question or went into another
No, not at all.
monologue.
No, I just yeah, I was going to press you on the question. Really, I'm curious about what those manuscripts, what those practitioners say specifically. If you forget to somehow offer the sacrifice or propitiate the spirit.
Okay, so that there is a really good actually work manuscript on that, and it's called Gabir, which is like an application. Every time you do certain magic, almost any incantation, there's an application. So there are certain plants that you must have with you, and there are certain rituals. Yes, rituals are important, but in Ethiopia they tend to be plants and important incantation. For example, there are places that you should not brew coffee. I don't know if you're aware, but coffee kind of comes from Ethiopia, was founded in Ethiopia. Its history is strongly tied with the Tsar cult, and also so sort of with the spirit world. But yeah, that things do go wrong if you don't have protection in some cases. And then I'll just say this quickly, and this is a very interesting one because it jogged my memory. This is a magic practice that exists in Ethiopia, divination practice, where you use a mirror to summon an entity through the mirror, and you begin to ask questions to this mirror. Now, this practice can only be done by a child. So the practitioners usually use young children to recite and then ask the child to ask certain questions, and the child will say, "Oh, I see this face, I see this," and thing. And what's interesting about that is that tradition also exists in Tibetan magic. So somebody told me about it. There's a similar magic in Tibet where they use mirror to summon them. So I guess in the Ethiopian tradition, there is a tradition that kind of controls them. If they appear to you as the previous speaker was saying, it's not common. It's not that much common where people have had those experiences and they have not understood it. There seems to be a tradition in Ethiopia where if you have such experiences, people listen to you. They do rituals, coffee ceremonies, etc. But there's a lot of work to be done, and I am exhausted of trying to research a lot of things. But this is definitely an area that should be looked into. Thanks.
Thanks, Eyob. You have that in Greece as well, the young boy using a mirror to divine and speak to the spirits. I guess the idea, or I thought the idea was because the child is pure and is kind of unpolluted. Sorita, maybe I can bring you in here. I can see you nodding your head.
I was just thinking you have very similar practices in the grimoire traditions that obviously is influenced by the practices of Greece. Everything from children, being used, there's a famous example, into olive oil onto a fingernail or into a glass of water, but often children are used, and it's exactly for that reason, because they're pure, which of course, is true of lots of practices linked to it, like the purification rituals to actually conjure various spirits that runs through a lot of different traditions. I come from a slightly kind of strange place where I've had one tradition being initiatory witchcraft that's kind of flown through my life for the last too many years, more than 30 years now. But I was born in Africa, in Southern Africa, so the traditions from there had a very strong influence on my life, especially because I studied some of the local languages. So I had lots of encounters and things as a child already, and then through to conjurations in the Goethic and Solomonic traditions, and spirit possession in various kind of things that I've bumped into. I spent some time working with somebody very closely within, I'm kind of trying not to say the name of the actual tribe, but within a tribe from southern Patagonia. And I had very powerful experiences in that as well. And I've spent time in Brazil and, all over the world, really. And I think that I'm listening to everybody and I'm thinking there's like similarities that flow through the different traditions. We call things by different names. And I'm a polytheist. I don't think everything is the same. I don't think all the gods are the same, all the spirits are the same, quite the contrary. But I think they are very similar ideas that flow through all these different beliefs and traditions that we have. And I think that personally is very fascinating. Like I said, my ritual and magical and spiritual path has been rooted in initiatory witchcraft, which is a very kind of British thing, I guess. But I got involved in Cape Town in South Africa, where I lived as a child, and it's just kind of drawn in so many different things. And I feel that the kind of experiences that we have through our lives, most of us, I think, that are drawn to working within these traditions and researching whichever niche it happens to be where we find ourselves, probably do so because we did have childhood experiences or prophetic experiences or dream states, which I don't think has been mentioned yet, or out-of-body experiences, for example. All of those are kind of true for me, encountering, the spirits of the dead, for example, as a child, having conversations, passing on messages, not knowing that this is not a normal thing to do. I think there's a lot of these kinds of things that flow through as a common theme through many of our lives that end up being drawn to, studying something esoteric. And I think when it comes to spirits, I always kind of think, what do we mean by that? Because, we've already mentioned so many different, ideas of what spirit is. And, I loved that you kind of brought it into the kind of idea of the ka and the kind of the soul and, all those kinds of things that do run again through the different traditions. But I think, my personal kind of feeling is that, understanding the kind of cosmology of what we work within and the cosmology of the land where we are rooted, the lands where we go to, and kind of understanding that there are local spirits as well as very universal ones that we can call on anywhere. For me, is part of my journey, at least, and I found that very, very helpful. I can't really, within the context of this, represent any one of the traditions that I've bumped into or worked in. I'm, happy to talk about it, but I think the kind of different rituals and the theological frameworks that we work with, there's just this striking consistency of the presence of an intelligence, of an effect. Whether we experience the spirits as, things in a dream state, which of course within ancient Greek, but also I think in other kind of indigenous practices that I've bumped into, kind of dream states and visions rank slightly higher than using divination or kind of going through somebody else, because it's a direct kind of, I guess, gnosis of the spirit or the god that you're trying to contact or that's trying to contact you. And so it's kind of got a slightly purer aspect to it. And, personally, that has been a very big part of my work is kind of working with, dreams, having visions. I don't know whether I'm blessed or cursed with having those. And, it takes a lot of effort sometimes to kind of stay grounded in a world where that is just part of my reality, when it's not the reality of those around me. But the kind of entities, I think, that I've encountered, I think would be everything from the spirits of the dead to kind of ancestral spirits of the land, which is not necessarily, like, I guess they are spirits of the dead, but maybe more from places and cultures where they were honoured in a different way, which of course was the case in kind of Christian traditions as well for a long time, but it no longer is. For most of us, at least not in Britain, I don't see a lot of that. So yeah, I come from a very, very mixed approach to all of this, but I have my own way of dealing with it after all these years. So yeah, I'm very happy to talk about anything specific. If somebody wants to, ask me something specific, I'm very happy to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to babble on about lots of different things and be very generous.
Thank you so much, Sorita. That was great. Well, that's one of the things that I'm really interested in. You mentioned the similarities between the different cultures. And one thing we have to remember as well, certainly in England, is that if you start talking about ghosts and spirits and learning the future from dead people in England, people will probably think you're mad. But if you talk about that in a lot of other countries, it's just totally normal breakfast conversation. So
that is definitely my. I mean, I travel quite a lot. I've spent a lot of time in other places,
and I think it's why we have these interactions as children so much as well, because we don't have the sort of rigid framework of what is real and what is unreal. And I'm inclined to think of reality really being a kind of imaginal field, and things can manifest within that imaginal field. And a few people have touched on those ideas as well. So one thing I really want to talk about is this idea of entities. Myron mentioned it with his personal experience as well of it's fairly common in a lot of ancient traditions that either the dead or these divine entities, nature spirits, know the future. And so I wondered if anyone would like to talk about that. If Sorita, you want to talk about that?
I've got lots of experiences like that, some of which kind of messed my life up quite badly, actually. I think that, obviously we've got to be careful, because if we're talking about the spirits of the dead, I'm not sure that I kind of try and avoid the dead. It's a strange thing for somebody who is a devotee and priestess of Hecate, who's the goddess of the restless dead. But maybe it's because she's the goddess of the restless dead that I'm slightly more, it bothers you. It's a lot of work. I don't personally think that the dead necessarily know more than what we do. I'm a little bit more linear when it comes to time and all those kinds of things, but I've definitely had experiences of things that came through for many years in my early 20s. I'll just admit this. I did start speaking about experiences when I was a certain age. So for a long time, I had like an entity that communicated with me in my dreams through post-it notes. Very short messages, and there'd be this like voice of God reading the messages just in case I couldn't read. And a lot of those kind of, I know it sounds bonkers, but, I think there are definitely entities that can predict the future or can warn us of something else that is already in motion, I think, of it, more than things that are inevitable. I think when we get those kinds of warnings or those kinds of messages, we can often change the outcome of it. Certainly for me, that is what it is in my experience. I've had an experience of transfiguration as well, where somebody, stood in front of me and their face completely changed, and it was like literally a mask going on it, and it wasn't in the context of ritual, and a certain message came out through that. Which also, kind of changed the course of many little things that I then subsequently did. I think, I don't know, like, I don't want to sound blasé, but I think when you get used to it, it's a little bit like what you say. It's like when it's part of your normal life, it's not something that you can necessarily talk about as much in some societies or some parts of the world. But I've been really lucky that I've been able to spend time in places where that is more normal, and with communities where that is more normal. And I'm still here to tell the story, I guess. But I'm not one that's very big on telling the details of personal experiences. It's not an art I've mastered just yet.
Great, thank you very much, Sorita. David, Beth, I thought perhaps this might be a good time to bring you in.
Yeah, let me navigate this technical issue here. All right. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Very interesting conversation so far. Just like Sorita, I was born in Africa, and I lived in Africa for a very long time, in Nigeria and other places, and in Brazil. So my background is, Afrocentric traditions into which I've been initiated. I'm a priest of Haitian voodoo, and lived in Brazil and became a priest of Kimbanda, and so on and so forth. So if you specifically speak about foretelling the future and these types of matters, they do exist, of course, in these traditions. I mean, spirits are called to predict the future for clients or, for initiates. So this, happens quite frequently. When I was married to my Brazilian ex-wife, she would, when we lived in Brazil, she would, before embarking on certain, bigger ventures or travels, she would at times consult the spirits, whether that would be a good idea. She would go to someone who can call down Eshu or, Pombagira or something, and then, see what they say about, the future plans and so forth. So that's a very, like Sorita said, in certain traditions, certain places, this is a very normal thing to do. Even for people who are seemingly super secular. Everyone who's lived in Africa for a long time, or even in Brazil, will certainly agree with me that even the most secular seeming people very often also often consult the spirits on certain matters or try to involve them in their plans. So basically the entire topic of entity for me, or entities, is very important. It's actually central. Coincidentally, without wanting to advertise, I literally just last week published a book where the idea of the pandemonium, or a world filled with entities, or even going as far as saying the entire phenomenal world. Exactly. Naomi, thank you for showing it. The entire phenomenal world basically is a world of entities, made up of entities, daemons, you could call them maybe, or souls or whatever. So that is at the center of my entire spiritual work. I guess you could label me a proto-animist, but I have been very strongly influenced by the Afrocentric traditions in my experience as a child, and being exposed to these kinds of things. And I've also studied the Western esoteric tradition, the usual stuff, grimoires and so forth. And some of you may know me still as the head of Michael Bertiu's magical orders and so forth. But what was always lacking for me in the West was that missing link, that missing link to a living tradition which has a cultus, a magical, or let's not a spiritual technology, a spiritual grammar, with which to place the individual within a world of spirits, and to kind of like create a coherent community and life out of it. I think Western people, I've come to see, are very insulated. They and that is not their fault. We have, and when I say Western, I mean Westernized people all over the world. It's not people in the West, not Americans or Europeans. It's even people in Africa and other places. The rationalized human being tends to be so isolated and insulated in their minds that meaningful connection, which goes beyond projection, wishful thinking, sentiments, aestheticism, is very, very difficult. And you can see it when you start to study within, just an example, like a tradition of like Haitian voodoo. And you go to Haiti, like I did, and you study and you immerse yourself. Maybe it was easier for me because my life in Africa, and having parents who have been interested in African spiritual traditions themselves. But the breaking down of the insulated Western human mind, which creates that monadic understanding, the subject and the object, to break this down beyond a wishful thinking or a projection, is immensely difficult. And if you do not have a community around you, a teacher, a cultus, a proven and tried technology which helps you to bypass certain issues, it's very difficult to create a meaningful relationship with the, let's call it like spiritual world, the demonic cosmos. And when I say demonic cosmos, I mean like even like a tree, like everything that has a power to affect you, everything that can enthuse you, basically, I consider to be a spirit or a daemon or a soul. And if we open ourselves up enough, everything can become that enthusing power, but we're lacking the technology and the skills and also the framework, the reference framework that allows us to make sense of such a type of relationship. And if we do not have the technology, it also becomes overwhelming for people who are actually inclined towards that, very sensitive people. Then they're considered mad, or, they're considered irrational, they're considered like, out of it and dreamy, and, all these labels. And especially in the world that we live in today, where the rational mind, the triumph of the will, if you so will, is paramount. So, for me, this is is at the center of my entire spiritual life and entire spiritual world. How can we return to a meaningful communication, relationality with the spiritual world, which for me, of course, is much larger than a pantheon of so and so many spirits or so and so many ghosts or whatever you want to call it. It's the entire phenomenal universe that is potentially connectable to. And of course, we have to find ways to do this. And some entities, some spiritual presences have more power in regards to connecting with us, because a mountain range is more dominant maybe for a person or a tribe living, or a people living at its slopes. If you live at down in Mount Etna, I guess the mountain plays a bigger role than for a people in a desert. So depending on where you are, what place you're at, and so forth, there are ways in which we can allow that relationality to become, again, a much more important aspect of our lives. And then that also changes the way we interact with our environment, other people too. So I could go on. I could just go on forever. So I better not. So I guess we can talk about different aspects while we go along. But
Yeah,
so
that was amazing.
that's just a place where I'm coming from, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a brilliant point about that idea of this insulation and this sense of separateness, and that we are a cohesive, contained entity. Whereas today it's more like a continuum of entity type forms everywhere.
Well, the entire Western world teaches us from a very young age that insulated human being. I mean, even Jungianism, psychoanalysis, all these things, we are being taught, oh, you're like a monad. You're like, don't let anyone change who you are. You're that firm you're that firm sense of self. And, we're being like exposed to this type of way of thinking from our earliest age. While when you are in Africa or when you're in other places, you still find very much that idea that the self is made up of various components, and these components also constantly change, and they constantly change in relationship with ancestors, with spirits, with whatever you encounter in the world. And there are spiritual specialists who can help you navigate this, or there are rituals you can do to navigate them yourself to a degree. This is another hybrid. When you're in the West, you think nowadays, oh, I just need to read a manual on magic and it's very simple. I just pour a little bit of liquid, which, I saw like some shaman do or some African priest, and I just do it all myself. And the spirits are here. This kind of simplistic, infantile way of approaching such a powerful world shows me very often. And I have been exposed to magical orders in the West for a very long time myself. This shows me that true contact to the spirits is very rare. Our colleague here from Ethiopia has said it, and Ethiopia, like obviously he said it's a Christian country, but even there, the seriousness with which spirits, entities are being approached in traditions which still have this living connection is completely different from the West. When I sometimes speak to my Haitian friends or other people, and they see how Westerners treat spirits or talk about spirits, and how, oh, it's simple. Today I talk to Hecate, tomorrow it's Odin, and the other next day it's like another spirit I read somewhere about. And they all talk to me. They're all my friends. They're all like easygoing. And, you don't need to sacrifice an animal to them. It's okay if you give them candy because they told me, and so forth. They can't imagine that this is actually happening. And I'm saying, like, no, this is real. This is actually the way many people in the West, because that's, that suits their way of life, that suits their sentiments, that suits their prejudices, this suits their current state of life. And this is how they then render their spiritual world like. It is not really understandable for people in other traditions where that living link is still established. And I have my whole life, looked for this type of link. So, I navigated and journeyed around. And then, I think that in the West, there's still a possibility to reconnect to that type of living community with the phenomenal world. But it has to become more serious, has to become less wishful thinking, less projection. And we have to find the technology with which to do it, and the seriousness that is necessary to break down the blockages which basically prevent us from reconnecting in that meaningful way. And that's possible, but it needs a serious approach that many people are lacking in a consumerist West, unfortunately.
Great, thank you very much. I definitely want to come back and talk about this idea of spirits being conjured to do your bidding, and a bit more about voodoo as well. But I want to get to Eyob quickly because I know he had to go at 7. So Eyob, do you want to? I know you've got your hand up as well, Peter. But Eyob, do you want to? Do you have a comment or a question for David?
Hi, sorry, just before I go, just to add one thing. One of the reasons why spirits or entity are respected, I say East African here, is also the power that they have for healing. This is one of the the big things. It's as if, I don't know, somewhere in the DNA has been written that these spirits are not only just guides, but they're there for healing as well. This is another thing I've come across quite a lot in Ethiopia. So I got to run, guys. It's late here. I have to catch my train. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you again, Eyob. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Peter.
Hi, lovely to see everybody here tonight. Couple of points. I also grew up in Africa, by the way. So there's quite a few of us here today. I was struck by what David has just said and the context that the philosopher Charles Taylor puts on this. You contrast the disenchantment of the West with an enchanted alternative possibility, and the sense in which the self is so buffered in the West, and that what is needed is the porosity of selfhood to be able to make the connections that David was alluding to. So when I consider this issue of porosity, all of us are built with some innate level of it, although the educational system and enculturation generally tends to inhibit it. So I've had a long-standing connection with a variety of spirits, but where it became really heightened was when I undertook energy healing work for a couple of decades. And in that context, because there's a meaningful focus for what you're trying to achieve, the clarity around issues of spirit and their visibility and our working with them comes into a very sharp focus. So I think this is what David was getting at. And as I have just said, healing is one of the key areas in which we can experience directly our interactions with spirit, but on both ends of the scale, by the way. So for me, some spirits are what I describe as parasitic. I would never say evil. And some of them are intercessory. That's to say they're helpful. And this includes an entire kind of spectrum of spirits. So we can have the people who've passed on interceding in the healing space. There may be information that they can bring to the healing context that facilitates healing to take place. So the context is kind of a pressure cooker in the sense that it's highly focused towards achieving something. It's not like you're just trying to call upon some random spirit to satisfy your curiosity. There's a deep level of meaning running through our connectivity with spirits. And that goes all the way up from people who've passed to what I would describe as higher order entities who make themselves known, but seem to control the exposure that they allow themselves. Okay. So that they will appear to some people and not to others, and they'll appear in forms which are often muted in comparison to how they could look, how they could appear. So all of this is like a web which is bound together by intentionality and a kind of evolutionary shift of consciousness towards a higher order. And I think when these conditions are met, we have a very fruitful interaction with the world of spirit. I think that's in a nutshell what I wanted to say. I don't want to go on longer.
Thank you, Peter. Your point about this idea of spirits appearing muted reminds me of that idea of the Greek gods not revealing themselves,
Yes,
or
exactly.
killing people in spontaneous combustion if
Yeah.
they do reveal their true form.
So I can give an anecdote here just to put some flesh on it. I was dragged along to a performance of I suppose, a medium His name is Tom Kenyon, and he uses the voice. He has his multi-octave voice. He uses that to connect with what he describes as higher order beings, known as the Hathors. Um, and during the course of his singing, I distinctly saw these tall columns of light manifest on the apron of the stage from which he was singing. They're very tall, I mean, meters and meters high columns of light. And then after a short while, they kind of drifted off the apron and up through the ranks of the audience and disappeared. Well, at the end of this seance, if that's what it was, one of the audience asked him, what do these Hathors look like when they manifest? And he said, oh, it's always as tall columns of light. So that was an interesting confirmation. Now, most of the people I was there with didn't see anything. When this this column of light kind of passed through me, it didn't give me any particular feeling. I had no reaction to it, but it was distinctly there. And so that's why I mentioned this kind of halfway house between manifesting and not manifesting. But nevertheless, the manifestation in its mode of manifestation was highly intensive. There was a purpose. And part of the puzzle of working with the world of spirit is that we have this part seen, part unseen relationship to it. And that's why I tend to emphasize coming into clarity through service, through an evolutionary service that naturally aligns with spirits as the only sure way of really getting on with them. Anyway, that's all I wanted.
Thank you very much. Drew, you've had your hand up. Nice to see you again, Drew. Haven't seen you for years.
Nice to see you, and forgive me for being a bit late to the conversation, but it's been fascinating to hear from everyone. And there's actually a few comments I wanted to, something that Peter Mark Adams actually said that I wanted to comment on, which was he spoke about the spirits as being sort of different types of maybe parasitic and intercessory spirits. And it reminded me of, so Edward Bulwer-Lytton is one of my favorites. He's a sort of 19th century occult writer. He wrote a wonderful novel called Zanoni. And sort of in one of these excerpts from the novel, he speaks about the fact that, there could be all different types of sort of gradations of spirits that by their very nature can be harmful to people. So it's not necessarily, it made me think of sort of like, for example, if I go outside right now and I'm just walking sort of in my garden and I happen to step on a snail, the snail is dead, but I had no intention to kill it. But because of the very nature of my being, the very nature of the snail's being, there's a conflict there. I'm inherently going to be harming the snail. So it's sort of, I think often, yes, you can, I think certainly you can go through these, when it comes to the spirits, you can have potentially a parasitic component or an intercessory component. But at the same time, I think it's also important to just speak about the very nature, the differences between natures of being. And I think it was also it was David Beth who spoke about like fullness, like a kind of pleroma, where everything is full of spirits. So it's like we're all sort of like New York City, we're all like combined together, and we're inherently going to be kind of jumbling against one another. And we're gonna have great experiences sometimes, and sometimes we'll have bad experiences. And then I think it's also comes down to I forgot who else mentioned about kind of preparedness and perhaps one's inclination to be open to having various experiences. And I can speak to, a book that I wrote recently, which focuses on Roma Lister, who was a 19th century occultist. She speaks a lot about this sort of these different gradations and also the fact that she herself, I think she was very, very open to the spirit world, not just because she lost her, one of her parents when she was very young, I think I think around the age of 6 or 7, but also because her mother was very much interested in spiritualism, and also her aunt was a medium. And I think when you grow up in a context in which the environment is sort of supportive of these sorts of experiences, then I think it helps you to unlock different parts of yourself that otherwise might be crushed by kind of the day-to-day experiences that we have sort of in the so-called West. Um, but yeah, so it's just very, very interesting to just understand and to think about the fact that how we can kind of access these regions, how we can connect with what we can't see, but what many of us can feel.
Thank you, Drew. Well, I think as individuals, we are colonies essentially, and we create this illusion of cohesion, but actually we are like a jostling New York City, even as a single human being. So it's kind of weird and interesting that we ever developed this idea of being a lone wolf. We mentioned mirrors as a magical practice a while back, and it's something that really interests me. This ability that we have now to always see what we look like, and to look into mirrors and take photographs and see ourselves in videos and see representations of ourselves. And I think something kind of happened to human consciousness when mirrors became everyday objects and we could regularly see our reflection very clearly. And when we couldn't see our own reflection all the time, we are much more likely to have this experience of a kind of group consciousness where we're constantly reflecting one another and thinking less about how we stand as individual people. There's the psychiatric disorder, the glass delusion, where when glass was introduced as a material, people started to think that they were actually made out of glass and they were going to shatter. So it shows how much we're projecting our consciousness all the time, and that it's not necessarily all that reliable. David, you've got your hand up as well. Thank you very much, Drew.
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me along. I'm just going to say something very quickly because I've got to shoot off as well. And I really, really enjoyed this whole discussion and all the speakers. I just wanted to tune in with something that Peter said about how these spirits or entities often don't show themselves fully, or they disguise themselves and appear in a way in which you can probably handle them. And as you're probably aware, there's a lot of interest currently with psychedelics and people having entity encounters on that, which seem to have missed the whole kind of discussion of the last few thousand years around, ritual and spiritual practices from people all over the world. But yeah, and people commonly, of course, encounter entities in those states. And just to give a quote relating to what Peter said from Terence McKenna is that, and I'm going to mangle this, is that we are in a symbiotic relationship with something so weird that it manifests itself as an alien invasion so as not to freak us out with what it really is. So I thought I'd toss that into the mix, and I'm going to have to dash off and cook dinner for my daughter. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you tossed aliens into the mix because we're definitely going to get to that. But Samantha has woken up at 3 a.m. in the morning, right, in Korea. And just in case she falls asleep mid-conversation, let's bring you in now.
Yeah, I actually canceled my alarm before bed because I was too tired, and I woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. from a dream that I was talking to you guys. And I was talking about the colander monster experience that I had of sort of going from sleep paralysis to an out-of-body experience and seeing this kind of like a Frankenstein monster made of like a colander and paper and all of these different household items, which was really weird. And it was in my nephew's room that I was staying at the time in Canada while he was away. And he was creeped out from that room. And I was also kind of creeped out from about sleeping in there. But that's what I experienced when I was sleeping in the room. And I was like, okay, all right, nephew. Yeah, I can see why you're creeped out by this room. But yeah, I kind of wanted to just mention a few things from what I've seen in the past few years is, so Sarah, you mentioned the glass delusion, and there's also fiction kin, what's known as other kin or fiction kin, or people who believe that their soul is part fiction. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying about mirrors and selfies, and we're our perspective has changed. So we're like self-centered in that sort of way, but not just as an individual, but as a culture, because we're not communing with nature as much. We can't read the signs of nature like our ancestors could. It's like we're in this, like Plato's cave, we're in this sort of bubble of our own creation of human thoughts. And that includes fiction. And we're so, unlike, generations past, we are always on our screens, whether it's televisions, computers, or smartphones, and whatever it's going to be in the future. But something that I've noticed is that these things come across as entities as well. So I don't have an answer for the colander monster that I saw, but I've also been hearing things like people in out-of-body experiences seeing Beavis and Butthead in their neighborhood among other like normal human, like flesh and bone people, or people seeing sleep paralysis shadow figures and they're holding iPads, which, their shadow figures in the past didn't have technology. And it's really odd. And also waking visions or waking hallucinations of people who see like Bugs Bunny or Kermit the Frog, and it might be Charles Bonnet syndrome, it might be something psychological, it might be, talking to these people, they generally seem to either see these things as shapeshifters, so it's not their true form, whether, which was mentioned earlier, it might be because, like aliens, they don't want to show their true form to not scare the person, and other people think it's to deceive them. And then others will say maybe it's a thought form, maybe it's something that's coming from my own mind or from somebody else's, or it's from the egregore, as you guys talked about before. Or these are originals. So, like, even if it's a fictional being, the writer was only tapping into a different dimension or something, a spirit, like even the spirit of Mickey Mouse or Harry Potter, like these shifters, these teenage shifters during COVID who were using altered states to reach Hogwarts in their kind of sort of, it sounds like astral projection to me, but much more controlled. And a lot of them believe that these things actually exist out there in different dimensions. And J.K. Rowling was only just picking up on that and like channeling it. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention that too, that these things seem to change with the times as well.
Yeah, very interesting. That reminds me, we talked about it a bit when we discussed the egregore, this idea, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's idea of the noosphere and this kind of intellectual, this idea of information having mass, and that we are creating alternate realities all the time whenever thoughts or ideas enter into the world. And I think of my own life as well. So very often I think, oh, I'm such a unique individual person. I've got so many unique individual likes. And then I will see an advert that I watched in the 80s when I was a kid. And I think my entire life actually is based upon this advert for My Little Pony that I saw, when I was 5-year-old, and that we are constructing our personalities where we used to live, like you say, amongst nature, and we knew the patterns of nature, perhaps our spirits had a bit more cohesion because we were all drawing from the same information field. And now that we have this, even more so now with the internet, we have all these various different inspirations and ideas and aesthetics and all this kind of stuff, that we're kind of recombining elements of those things all together in our kind of waking visions. Thank you so much. That was great. Yeah. I just want to get to Ryan, because Ryan hasn't spoken yet, and I know that he can talk about dreaming and sleep paralysis and these kinds of things. So Ryan, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. It's really good to be here, y'all. I'll keep my comments brief because I have to go pick up my kid from school in a few minutes. My I guess, entryway into this is through sleep paralysis personally. And that's where my research has often centered with lucid dreaming as well, is this experience of being in an interaction with an unknown figure, with a stranger in the room. And I think in the West, as it's been talked about, I think that so many folks have these experiences as, they're uninitiated. I speak for myself, I'm uninitiated into deeper mysteries, into traditions. And when they happen spontaneously, it freaks folks out and they don't know what to say or do about it. And of course, there's so many taboos about it, and the experience is often negative. But I have had many experiences in sleep paralysis of contact that were positive. And in fact, I've had healing experiences as well. There was one time, and the one that maybe this is the story I'll tell, this was probably about 15 or maybe even 20 years ago. And having already experienced sleep paralysis since I was a kid, since I was a teenager, and it was always negative and something to avoid and get out of and get away from. This time what happened is, as I felt the experience of getting pressed upon, right? That feeling of paralysis, and then this feeling of something is with me, and it's so palpable, this experience. It's not dreamlike at all. It's quite real. It's as if you are talking and someone's in the room, and not just wandering around, but you're cued into them, right? And they're cued into you. And I had this fear arise. Okay, it's going to happen again. And I let myself have some trust. I let myself have almost faith, which is not a word that I use often in my context. And what happened is that the room rotated. I was sleeping on my stomach, and gravity rotated 180 degrees. And so I now was on my back in my experience, and the entity emerged as a figure of light, as a feminine figure. And she put her hands on me, and she put her hands on my gut, which is a place that I have all kinds of issues and have since I was a kid, in bowel issues and whatnot. And I was inflamed at that point. I know this is probably too much information for y'all, but it's true. And what happened is I felt the warmth and I felt the energy come from this encounter, and then she went away. I woke up. Literally, gravity floated back. There was this rotation effect again. And when I emerged from the encounter, my inflammation was lower and I wasn't in pain. And I had gone to sleep in pain. And so that was a healing encounter. It was my aha moment that there's more to this than I understood. And it kind of got me started on this conversation. So that's just my entryway into this. I know that there's so many more angles. But I think that why I love this talk in general is that sleep paralysis, dream researchers, we need to be in contact with all of these, with each other, because I think that we can learn from each other, and the tactics sometimes I think that they can help one another. So thanks for that, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That was great. I want to expand upon that sleeping posture thing, actually, and entity encounters a bit later on. But Maya, we haven't had Maya yet. Maya.
No, I finally figured out how to raise my hand. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to go back to kind of what David and Peter were saying about the idea of the self, and in the West, kind of how we see the self as this one entity and how in places like Africa and Aboriginal and animist communities, the self is this ecology. And the self is an ecology even scientifically because of all of the different components and microbiome within our body. But the idea of the porous self in these cultures means it incorporates the ancestors, it incorporates the dead, the self incorporates spirits and plants and the environments and other people. So these entities that we perceive as alien, and even more entities that present to us as alien, aren't actually alien at all. And we just see them as alien because of this modern alienation we've created in individualist culture. And then potentially they're the parts of us we've alienated from ourselves, whether you take the perspective of them being from our psychology or agentic, it doesn't really matter. But from that perspective, in animistic communities, the job of the person is to maintain the health of this ecology. So maintaining these relationships between all of these different entities in our ecological world, which is our self. And I think it's interesting, these practices and like these cultures that use spirits to do their bidding, like you said, Sarah, or like to be bound, like in some occult practices and cultures. And like maybe I'm just like coming from a very woke perspective, but I see that as like this continuation of violence and dominance towards these beings that extends to how we treat the natural world, because there's this overlap between our relationship with discarnate beings and nature, which is obviously being completely destroyed at the minute. But yeah, so that's why my personal interest is quite in these relationships we build with these beings, and the idea of cultivating like multi-species alliances and respect and consent to when we meet them, and not approaching them from a colonialist or conqueror's kind of way. And yeah, so, and my background's working with indigenous groups in Central and South America, and also introducing animistic worldviews and practices to people in the West and in DMT research. And yeah, so I think also something else I want to say is like, going back to what you were talking about, Danny, is that core to all of these cultures is that having relationships and interacting with entities, whether that's you wanting to get something from them or you wanting to get them to leave you alone, it's through giving first, it's through offering, so giving before you ask. And if the spirits or the entities aren't fed and that relationship isn't nurtured, you're not going to get shit. And so that reciprocity is paramount. And, you know, like we were saying, that often extends to, you know, sacrifices of life and blood. So, yeah, I also think, you know, we're taught that quite young in the West when we're encouraged to like feed Santa Claus and like give our teeth to the tooth fairy to get the cash back. And we have this very like transactional relationship with our first introduction to these discarnate beings. Yeah, so I think that is something that is important in the discussion that I wanted to add.
Great, thank you very much, Maya. Really good. Joe, I want to bring Joe in as well because Joe hasn't spoken yet.
Thanks. Hi. Oh, so many great points. I've just had so many ideas pop in response to what people are saying. But I guess I wanted to make the point that for us, I mean, for myself, I think I've probably had the sense of entities being around from, you know, the very, very beginning and in various ways through my life. And I know a lot of people here will be the same, just being very open to that. And I think it's interesting for people that aren't used to these worlds, when those times when they do have experiences are usually when they are on the edge of something. And often it can be things like when they're ill. You know, when people are ill, they're sort of in a slightly altered state, and they will see things, feel things. They might even just feel their ancestors around, or, you know, when kids have a fever and they see beings appear. I know that happened to me as a kid. I'm sure for loads of us, that was, you know, interesting memories to look back on. And the meaningfulness of that, you know, I really remember a lot of what happened in those kinds of experiences. So I think that, you know, entities are everywhere. I even think it's a really interesting idea. Not only are they in kind of nature, you know, with our ancestors, spirits of just the landscape where we are, and do seem to be definite presences in certain landscapes. Or one thing I think about is if we are open, and sometimes we're not even really aware that we're doing it. When we meet each other or we meet a situation, if we're open enough, there's something that moves through us in order to meet something in somebody else. So we might find that we're in need of something and that person will come forward, and it kind of will, sometimes it will surprise them because they've acted in a way that they didn't kind of plan to or mean to, but there's something about the way if they are open, that something we are able to meet each other in a way, because something's moving through us. And I think that that's an interesting idea to look at when thinking about entities too. So yeah, it's I've just very much enjoyed listening to everybody tonight, and it's given me lots to think about. I've got to head off shortly, but yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you very much, Jo. Myron, you've had your hand up for a while, so do you want to say something now? Maybe Myron's gone for a little walk. Danny?
Yeah. Yeah, what Maya said there was super interesting, about how we interact with these entities in a lot of traditions which come from like slave traditions. I think particularly Haitian voodoo and some other ones. You let the spirit take you over. You let, like, it rides you. You know, you kind of open the doors and it jumps in. And in the magic of the empire, we tend to put them in a triangle, subject them to contracts, threaten them, and then tell them what we're going to do if they don't do our bidding. I'm working with a woman at the moment who's very much into Goetia, like Solomonic magic, that kind of style. But she sees the entities, or rather those particular spirits of the Goetia, as things which were bound by this kind of tradition of domination, but that retain. And she's her one element of kind of the one place she's grateful to those kind of, they call it the Ars Paulina, the Solomonic magicians, is that they kept alive these names like Astaroth and Belial and all these kind of guys who she interacts with in a much more kind of free form way. And I'm very interested by how she does it. It's really not my way of working with them. To me, in a more, and I'm not saying this is the right way of thinking about this, but I've tended to see, I'm not talking about all spirits here, but I'm talking about the spirits of the Goetia as a bit more like chainsaws or bulldozers or something like that, in that they are very powerful, and you know, you wouldn't pick up a chainsaw without putting on your gloves, unless you're a fool. I don't know how I feel about approaching them as in the same way I might approach you know, something which is alive, like you know, a puppy. And I'm not talking about all spirits like this. I'm talking very specifically about those ones. But yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. I think where the trouble comes is if we approach, like, let's say you approach a horse, but you don't know what you're doing and you touch it in the wrong place and it kicks you in the face, you know. So that's kind of where my worry is. We have a way of dealing with I'm talking about this colonial tradition. We have a way of dealing with those spirits that limits the danger whilst making them useful to do well in the tradition of King Solomon to build the temple. If we approach them more touchy-feely, especially, I mean, the lady who said that she woke up at 3:33 in the morning, and I cross myself because that is the dweller in the abyss, and fills me with fear when I see his number or hear his name. That's the kind of guy who will try and that's the kind of guy who'll try and break out of your circle. So yeah, I want to say that, and I just wanted to respond to David as well. And I'm not disagreeing. I'm actually agreeing with something, but I think the way that I would have framed it a bit different. He said spirit contact is very rare. I think that spirit. I think he said that. I might be mischaracterizing. I think spirit contact is horribly common, and I think it's nearly always done unconsciously. I think it's a bit like, most of the time we're getting on our mobiles and we're phoning up random numbers and saying, what should I do about my collapsing marriage or something? You're going to get some advice, but you might not be getting it from the Archangel Michael or someone relevant. So it feels like we are, I don't know what's the metaphor, but walking with mosquitoes all over us, or like doors with our or like houses with our windows open, and the world makes a lot more sense when we look at it regarding these spirits that are moving around. I was going to say one more thing, actually, if I may. I used to look after the academic ayahuasca list of a whole bunch of researchers, and we were looking at this one particular case where it was an Australian guy and a British guy, no, sorry, a Canadian and a Brit who were out in the jungle somewhere. And one of them I took some notes of this earlier. One of them had basically grabbed a knife in the session, and he'd shouted to the other guy, "You are Yahweh, you are Yahweh. It's time to get your demons out, brother." And he basically took the knife to the other guy. And this is what gets really interesting. The other guy then defended himself, picked up a pan. The knife hit the guy, broke the knife, broke the pan. And then what he says is, he says, oh yeah, what I was saying to myself is if he gets this knife back, he's either going to kill me or the two other men here. And that's when I made the decision to stab him. So you've got the situation where one guy gets a knife, and then his other guy, who's actually his very close friend, gets into his head that he's got to stab this guy to death in order to protect everybody else. And this is and all of the researchers, all these academics were looking at this. Isn't it strange that these two people kind of went off and they were both mad in this one session? I'm thinking that's not strange at all. That's a murderous spirit that got involved in the session, was jumping from one to the other. A lot of things make a whole lot more sense when we start to kind of view them. And I know I'm kind of concentrating on the negative side of spirits here, or the dark side of spirits. I adore them. I'm an entity myself, and I'm just kind of bringing it up because these are powerful things that we're engaging with.
Thank you very much, Annie. I have to bring David Beth back now, just for a bit to talk to that.
Well, that was interesting. Also, Joe and Maya, very interesting things said, and would agree with really most of it. And just to quickly, because Danny mentioned that I meant like spirit contact in the West is rare. What I really actually meant was that to know whether the spirit contact was actually there, or whether it was a projection, or whether it was another type of emotional reaction, or so forth, is very hard to determine, because we do not have the community and the, like I said, the cultures or the technology around which actually helps us to determine whether it is real or not. We do not grow up in a world where relationships with spirits is a normal thing. And the porous self comes into play here as well. So you mentioned ayahuasca, which is very interesting, because when I lived in Brazil, I attended lots of Santo Daime and other types of ayahuasca meetings and stuff like that. And I've been involved with that myself in those places. And what I saw, what was also very interesting, the indigenous people who used ayahuasca and other, psychedelics in Amazon, they study the plant for so many years. They do, they really kind of like have this as a part of their spiritual ecology, within which they place certain experiences. And then I've met also lots of spiritual tourists from the West, not to discount all their experiences. On the contrary, lots of them had a lot of important breakthroughs. But it's actually interesting. Of course, it's not the same, let's say, to just go to an ayahuasca ceremony, take it, and have experiences, and kind of like liken them to the experiences of traditional indigenous practitioners who employ this in their spiritual and communal world, because it's a very different mentality that you actually have when you go into it, and within which you use it. But these are kind of experiences from also my background and knowing people work with this a lot in Brazil, in other places, is that these can break open certain insulations. And then when you have a framework then where you can place that, and I think we've talked about it before, someone else said it, the West lacks that kind of referential framework in which we can place certain experiences, because we do not have living communities which actually practice the porous self versus and with the world. Just one further thing. Also, since Maya mentioned Central and South America, which is where I lived many years as well, and studied, Kimbanda and Umbanda and Candomblé and so forth. It's very, and also Haitian voodoo. You can and cannot really contrasted with Western forms of magic, like the Guaisha and stuff like that, and kind of say like, well, Guaisha is coercive, and these indigenous traditions are not so much. Yes, there are these differences, and there are also cross-fertilizations, interestingly enough, in Haiti. For example, they use some of the grimoires and some of the aspects of the grimoires in some of the rituals. Certain people do. But also in Haiti and in South America, Africa too, there are certain spirits who are so violent, so aggressive, and so overwhelming that they need to literally be chained up. So you literally have actual chains, or sometimes barbed wire wrapped around their let's call them fetishes, for to make it simple now, around their habitats, to keep them symbolically chained. But we also have to throw overboard our Western sense of morality. Oh, this is like mean to the spirit. So of course, there's a very different way of approaching the spirit world. There are hot spirits, cold spirits. These need to be cooled down. These need to be whipped up. And when you work with a spirit to get him to do something, when you send a spirit on an expedition, as the Kimbandistas or the Voodooists would say, sometimes you have to whip them up. You have to like sacrifice. You have to also, use other means to kind of create a certain heat with which to propel the spirit, or to which you fire him up with. And sometimes these are very violent means, depending on the spirit you work with. So we have to also be very careful not to glamorize these traditions in order to kind of like, satisfy a certain kind of disenchantment in the West. We have to especially, however, do not apply our current common moral categories, which we always do. That's why, in the West, like, everything changes. Today we like this, today we like that. It's okay to give the spirit blood today, but maybe tomorrow that's morally incorrect, and so forth. This is quite random. So this doesn't really work in these kinds of traditions, right? So we have to, if we engage with these native traditions, we have to maybe use or maybe throw overboard some of our moral categories, our sentiments of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. You know, there's always a lot of discussions about blood sacrifice. Is that cool? Is that uncool? You know, should it be done? Should it not be done? You know, and you know, of course, you know, there are good arguments for it. There are some arguments against it, but you know, personally, we cannot apply Western saturated sentiments, you know, into other traditions. Also, just that would be the last thing I would say. If you go to Haiti, even South America, it is a violent place, right? So violence, murder, death, brutality. I just spoke to a friend of mine in Haiti who had to basically, you know, I helped them to flee Port-au-Prince to the countryside because Port-au-Prince is basically in anarchy, and the gangs are like raiding the entire city, and they try to kill the gangs with drones, and there's gunfire everywhere. I mean, when I was in Haiti last, you know, I had to drive through burning barricades to get to where I need to go. It was crazy. So it's been like this for years. And Africa, I lived in Nigeria. It's like this, you know, it's been like this there as well. So, you know, these people grow up with violence and death, and it's completely normal. They do not keep themselves with these moral ideas that we have towards sacrifice, blood, death, you know, and it's understandable. And I think we have become also insulated, you know, from these kinds of ongoings. And then we can see it, of course, then if there's a war, or even when there was Corona, suddenly we couldn't plan ahead. You know, our holidays that we had planned were kind of like in jeopardy. Like, oh my God, I remember like the collapse of sanity in the West during Corona, because everybody was having a mental crisis. When I spoke to my friends in Africa and Haiti, they're like, you know, Corona, it's not a big deal. You have much bigger problems to worry about. And that's not to downplay all the issues and mental challenges people had during those days, but we are not prepared for these kinds of things. And we must be very careful when we apply our Western thinking from the place we come to other traditions, and then take things out of it and try to mold them into our work and stuff like that. We have to be very, very careful when we do that. And we have to apply this very, you know, sensibly, in my opinion. So
thank you, David. Myron, I missed you last time. You must have popped off. Would you like to speak about something?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that even though I was raised as a Christian, and when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I got very involved with the I Ching and Chinese traditions. Lao Tzu was one of my heroes. My spirit guide has no connection with any culture of any kind in history. My spirit guide is an individual being that is outside of all cultures everywhere. It's pure light, it's pure love. It has no contradiction of pure thought and acceptance of the soul of the person that it's working with. And in my case, I know that Karen has worked with other people besides me. The fact is that she is pure love, and that's all she is. She can't be anything else. And that kind of relationship that's symbiotic is so unusual in most traditions. Even in Christianity. Christianity is a blood religion. Christ was killed on a cross. He was murdered. All right, so that's a human sacrifice religion. And even though I was a Christian and I went to seminary, at some point I had to leave that behind in order to go on to the purity of this light being that you could call an alien if you wanted to, since my connection with Karen, a lot of the time she takes me to that planet I told you about in Orion. So is she an alien, or is she a spirit guide, or is she just pure light? She doesn't give me all those answers because sometimes I'm not ready for those answers. But the fact is that if you start a relationship with an entity, and that entity is pure love, that's what you will get. And that's all you will get. And pure love can be very tough. I mean, it can be very hard on you because you have all of these ego questions that you want answered, and she's just not going to give it to you because you're not ready to hear it. When you're like, I'm 82 now. So at 82, I've gotten the death situation completely under control. I have no fear of death at all. I almost died just 3 or 4 months ago. And I had a vision during the death of this transcendental, most beautiful place I've ever seen. And it was all light and crystals and particles and total absorption into the unity of all things. All things are unified in the experience of these beings that I have been connected to since I was 4. So the idea of multiculturalism and studying cultures, well, I've studied them all too. And most of them I let go because of the violence and the sexism and all of that stuff that was in those traditions. What I took out of them when I was studying was the positive parts of them, especially Tibetan Buddhism. But I had to let all of those go, including my own tradition, to follow my own path. As Joseph Campbell would say, you get on the pollen path. You take the road. The road takes you where you need to go. You just follow the path. And the path, if you get your ego out of the way, will completely take you where you need to go. Now, I'm still on that road. I'm 82, and I've been on it since I was 4. And I have never been pushed or motivated in any negative way to follow this particular discipline. The discipline itself is a living, breathing thing that is in me, that is available worldwide. Most of my visions, believe it or not, most of them are terrestrial. Trees that open and talk to me, and mountains that change shape, and sky, and the sky above, the mud below, all of those traditions, even rain. But I am now outside of those traditions, and I spend most of my time in these areas of light and crystallization of light and the manifestation of what life and love, those two married together, have brought me to a place where I never thought I would ever be. I'm at peace. You know, the one thing that I wanted to be at when I was very sick for my whole life, I had epilepsy my whole life, was I wanted acceptance and I wanted peace. I think those were my main goals. And when Charon finally gave me the answer to how to break through the mirrors, you talked about the mirrors. She took me to a room of mirrors, and she said, look in every mirror in the room. There were about 14 or 15 of them in a circle. And every mirror was a different dispensation, a different place to go, a different way of being. So I could pick whatever mirror that I wanted to go in this particular vision that I had. And I couldn't choose. And she said, okay, she wasn't trying to push me in any particular direction. And then I turned and looked, and I saw the mirror that was pure light. So it was no reflection of me. It was just pure light. It was the only one that was like that. And I hadn't seen it before she gave me permission to not worry about it. And then that light just poured into me, and I was just not there. I was gone. And whatever was left in that room of mirrors has now been assuaged and is gone. All my negativities of that of all of those cultures I read about the war that I was involved in, about my parents' abuse of myself, about all of the traditions that have holes in them by everybody knows about, Catholicism and about all of them. And I think that there was an odd scripture I remember reading years ago when I was when I was in seminary, and it said, "Many are called, but few are chosen." Christ said it in Matthew. And I thought, what in the world does that mean? Many are called, but few are chosen. I think what my interpretation of that, in its Coptic interpretation, is that we get to choose whether we want peace and light and love or we don't. Okay? You can do that if you're a prisoner. You can do that if you're in a concentration camp. You can do that if you're working in business. You can do that any and under all circumstances. You can choose light and love over negativity if you just get your ego out of the way. Even though people will mistreat you, because they will, even though the world is a very dangerous place, and it is, you still have the right and the mission to follow your bliss, as Joseph Campbell would say. And if you follow your bliss, that bliss will take you into the light always at every stage of your life. Even like this, I go out of body a lot. And when I go out of body, I make all kinds of journeys into all kinds of dimensions. And I can't go into all of that because it's just too long. But the fact is, I go out of body a lot. And the near-death experiences I've had, especially this recent one, I was on the floor. I had about 30 minutes left to live. That was it. And the medics broke in because I could not get to the door to open it. They broke in, and I was laying unconscious on the floor. But before I went unconscious, I saw this panorama of just beauty and light and crystal shinings in the universe. I mean, I just felt like I was one with the universe. I had no fear. If I had died that morning, I only had 30 minutes left, it would have been fine with me. I mean, it was so beautiful and positive and filled with love. I have never felt that kind of love. I mean, it's agape, there's no question about it. It's not eros. And that agape love, I didn't even know what that meant when I was a Christian. Now I do know what that was meant. But it took 82 years to get there. But I got there, okay? Even though I've had other death experiences, that I didn't have that same kind of resolution of negativity. So to finish this up, when I came out of the coma that I went into when I was in the hospital, and Dr. Death, as I call him, came to me to ask me, do you want to be, interfered with? Do you want us to operate on you if we have to? That all this stuff they ask you when they think that you're terminal. My answer to him was, that those things are just not relevant to anything. I am free of all of those kinds of restrictions. And Karen was in the room. Karen's in the room now, right here where I'm sitting. She's never, ever not with me. And, there's somebody asked me one time, how do you know that Karen is not a demon? How do you know that she's not a demon? She could be a demon. I said, no, because Karen can only give me positive things. She can give me happiness, love. She can give me the positive manifestations of her nature. A demon can give you power, money, sex, everything, but he can't give you that because that's not its nature. The demon's nature is destruction. That's the only nature it has. Something that is an angel, quote unquote, or a positive being can only give you love and light. That's the only thing that they can give you. So in my case, all of the negativity of my life, which has been very, very hard, besides war and being an epileptic and all the rest of it, when you have a companion that loves you unconditionally, nobody loves anybody unconditionally in the human world. Just think about it. There's always conditions in the love between two people or between groups. There's always conditions. Unconditional love is so foreign to our understanding of its properties that we don't know it when we see it. But in my case, I've come on the road down here now to a place where I have incorporated that into my pantheon of being. And it has taken me 82 years to get here, but I got here. And now it's just gravy. It's just wonder. It's just magic. It's just so fulfilling. It has nothing to do with culture or the past or what people have believed. It's what I have believed, what I have experienced on the road paths that I took. Those, and I kept a record of them. I've got, 5,000 art pieces that I've done and journals that are filled with those experiences. And I think if you, like Joseph Campbell said, and I'll close with this, if you follow your bliss will take you where you need to go. If you don't follow your bliss, you're not going anywhere. So you're right where you are, whatever that is. I remember all my colleagues, they didn't even want to hear this kind of stuff. And they were businessmen and they liked golf and sports, and that was their life. They weren't interested in anything I had to say about what I just talked about with you. That's what they're choosing to be. That is their manifestation of this life. My manifestation of this life has always been a spiritual one. So some people have called that shamanistic. Yeah, I'm a kind of shaman. That's true. I've gone through a lot of those particular things that I can't talk to you about now. It's just too long. But so I'll close with that when light comes to you and love comes to you and you accept it, you will never be the same. You can't be, because once you've opened that door, you can't close that door. The trick is opening the door in the first place, because opening the door requires giving up your ego and your particular ideas of what is true and what is not true. You have to let that go in order to move forward and cross into what they would call nirvana. And you could be a bodhisattva, but if you went into nirvana, there are no opposites. There's no up, there's no down, there's only now, and we exist in this pure bliss of nirvana. Now, I'm not there
that
yet.
is a very positive and optimistic message, isn't it, Myron? Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay, sorry I took too long.
No worries. I want to bring Jack in because Jack hasn't spoken yet. And then Susan, want to get to you because I want to talk about aliens. But Jack.
Well, there's loads of things that have been popping into my mind as we've been talking about all of this stuff. And I just give myself a little list of things to quickly mention. The first is high strangeness entities, all of the weird kinds of entities that appear in UFO experiences. We touched on DMT experiences where people encounter mantises and all of this kind of crazy stuff. But some of the UFO experiences are kind of equally as trippy. And something that I've been fascinated with it recently is these high strangeness entities. I'll give you a couple of examples. We need to bring into this melee of different things that people are experiencing and describing. Entities like Sam the Sandown Clown, for instance. These kind of beings that mix up all sorts of different characteristics from different animals, from different kinds of objects. Sam the Sandown Clown has wooden components. He has a clown-like face. He says that he is a bit like a ghost in some kind of ways. So there's all of these, with these kind of figures, they kind of overlap with each other, different characteristics emerge. So that's one thing that I want to just point out. So we need to dig into those high strangeness entities a little bit more. On the issue of the porosity of self, in my field work with mediums in Bristol, one of my main conclusions was that their sense of self, which they developed through mediumship experiences of interacting with different kinds of spirits and these kinds of things and going into altered states and trances, was that they had this more what we would call a non-Western sense of self, even though they are fully Westernized sort of suburban Bristolians. And when I interviewed them and asked them about, you know, how they understood what the nature of their self was, they told me that the self was like an onion. It had layers. There were many parts to it. They talked about how the spirits would come into their consciousness and, you know, help them out in situations. Some of these kinds of things we've been touching on already. So there's this idea of a polypsychic kind of being that we are, made up of not just parts of ourselves, but also parts of other spirits. And so this kind of non-Western porous sense of self also exists in Western frameworks. And I think it's actually an experiential thing. Like you might be brought up in a bounded individualistic Western culture, but you have these experiences that kind of challenge those cultural models. And then the last thing I'll mention is to do with aliens and this idea of these beings being kind of, you know, alien and outside and foreign and xeno and all of this kind of stuff. And just thinking back to my experience with spirit mediums, they talked about this kind of gradual process of learning and getting to know their spirit guides. And initially, a lot of the time, the experiences would begin as a very kind of frightening encounter. And I think that human beings have a kind of, you know, an automatic, I could call it a feeling response when they encounter these other things. Some people call it the, you know, the numinous or the Oz factor and all of this kind of stuff. And then you have to kind of get over that initial fear. And Christine, the circle leader at the Bristol Spirit Lodge, she described how she used to have these encounters with this creature that would seem to talk to her, floating above her left-hand shoulder, that she gave the name Fuzzy Critter. And initially, it used to be really kind of challenging for her, but she learned to appreciate its kind of you know, influence in her life, the suggestions that it gave her, the insights that it gave her, and all these kind of things. And this gets me thinking about this idea also of familiar spirits. And, you know, if you learn, when you learn to become, when you become familiar with these spirits that are initially alien, then they become kind of helpful, useful partners in a way. So, you know, there's whole loads of other things that I could mention, but, you know, there's three things that we need to really think about is the high strangeness entities, the role of things like seances, rituals, for engendering this sense of this more porous kind of consciousness. And it's not just a Western or non-Western thing. And then, yes, this idea of becoming familiar with the alien and learning, you know, it's like a cultural exchange. You know, there's a lot that we could learn from these spirits once we get over the fear. There we go.
Thank you, Jack. There is a long association with this idea of trauma leading to these sorts of entity encounters, usually fearful ones. And I think sometimes the same kind of thing happens in accidental traumatic experiences that happens in carefully constructed ritual environments as well, where there is just this leaving the body. I think is usually associated with OBEs. We disassociate and we leave our body, and that provides an empty vessel for some other entity to jump in. And there are lots of kind of accounts of that. Let's carry on the theme of aliens, as you brought it up, with Susan.
Hi there. I had to find the unmute button. Yeah, well, with my experiences that I had talked about personally before as a child, I really didn't know how to frame them other than what I was exposed to through pop culture. I thought that maybe I had been interacting with ghosts. And then through my teen years, I kind of tried to put that aside and maybe to make myself feel better. I wanted to consider it more maybe childhood imagination. But then in my early 20s, I had a very dramatic encounter with UFOs. And that to me, through many years and decades, and trying to process all of that information from the UFOs and becoming an independent researcher into UFOs, am I frozen? Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me, Sarah? Okay, you guys can. Okay, I think Sarah's
It's Sarah's
frozen for
frozen.
me. Yeah, okay. Yeah, but I think after processing all of that information and becoming involved in paganism and animism, I kind of integrated all of these experiences within my own spirituality. And I created a framework more or less for myself because one really didn't exist before that. So I guess what I'm trying to say with the UFO encounters is that when I was able to accept that it was something that was actually happening in the consensus reality that I was living because there were other people with me experiencing these things. And then later, as opposed to pushing them away, embracing them as an actual reality, it brought me more into my spiritual self. Later, I learned that some of the contactees that came way before me were getting these messages of we have to be better stewards to Earth at the same time when I was finding Gaia and feeling that I need to be a better steward myself for this planet and leading with compassion and kindness. I was able to integrate all these terrifying things and make sense of them for myself. And I think we need to be listening more to people and giving them safe spaces to talk about their experiences. Some of them are very horrific and terrifying, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But some of these experiences, when we can accept that they're not necessarily a part of being crazy. And believe me, I went through years of therapy too, as well, that didn't help, that didn't stop these experiences. In fact, like I said, the more I pushed them away, the more they were happening. Until I was finally able to just kind of integrate it all with acceptance. And that took a lot from myself, but also finding community within other people who were having these entity experiences. So then the alien became more something that I'm happy with, I'm good with. It's not really so much alien anymore as an extension of myself, although I do feel these are also spirits that are outside of myself. They exist on their own. And that may become more from my I live now in a very, I came from a city. I live in a very rural area now, in a mountainous area, and I spend a lot of time in the forest and with the rivers and the plant life. And I find that that as well has helped me to integrate this into who I am by being part of the nature and the other that does exist. And it's not all coming from me. I can say that, but yeah, it's something that we have to take seriously. And when children say, "I've had these experiences," or "I've had something strange," it's imperative not to just say, "No, that can't be," because these experiences for some of us will keep going on, and it's harming. If you just try and say, "Oh no, it's nothing," it just causes harm. And clearly it is something. As far as the UFOs go, the last time I saw one in 2016, it was frightening just because it was very startling. It again, it was with other people that I saw this large thing. And at that point as well, I realized what I'm seeing, this technological vehicle may not really be what it is. It's something else. And this is just how my modern sci-fi loving brain is trying to process it all. So there's that as well. But I like the more I do, the more I learn, the more I interact with spirits, the less the more I know that I need to learn a lot more. Sorry, I'm a bit tired here, but it's something that I do have a great passion for, and I could speak probably all night too. So I'm gonna just leave this to others now. Thank you.
That makes me think of that model of consciousness as the brain being like a receiver, and rather than consciousness arising in the brain is a filter through which we process the world, the cosmos, and everything else. And our kind of modern conception of who we are and consciousness is an invention. Anyone who's done like long periods of silent meditation, you really see how your personality and this idea of self is an invention that we have. Like I said in one of the last sessions, we're essentially living stories. We have this story about who we are, but it's not really true ultimately. I want to open it up now to everyone. We don't have too much time left. It's been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. And I'll just open it up for the next 10 minutes or so to give people a chance to ask any direct questions to the speakers that we've had. Naomi.
Wait. Hi there. So, hi there. So I'm a psychiatric nurse. I, on a daily basis, work with people who are in psychosis, who experience entities. These entities tell them to kill themselves or harm themselves. And I have to emphasize with that. And then try to, experience that too. And see what's happening to them that makes them want that, or or what tells them, what kind of entities tells them to kill themselves, for example. So that's a difficult process. And I've been listening all evening. I mean, when I was a child, I definitely had invisible friends. I played with my bear and I thought I was on a princely court. And I transported myself to invisible realms where courts were, and I was there as well. In the 90s, I worked as a sorcerer and I evoked spirits. I've never evoked them as entities. I've never experienced them as entities, but they were always there more as function than as like shape. So they were there in their function. They did what they needed to do, but they were never there as your shape or form or as a character. So I could never identify them in that way. So then I evolved in my process and in my evolution as a magician or as a sorcerer or sorceress, how would you say that? And I started invoking a goddess, and I arrived and Hecate called me, and me and Hecate became one and the same. And that was a very different experience. And I heard a lot of talk about the porous identity. And sometimes that's very difficult because it's very difficult to explain what it is like to be the same person as a goddess and what identity or entity is like, or does entity exist, or is this kind of dualism even valid, in which a term like entity has a place? This is what I'm wondering. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Anyone want to take up that question?
I can do that if you want.
Brilliant.
Yes. So Naomi, hi. Two things. You mentioned, firstly, people hearing voices and then acting on it. So going back to the first, we actually have many examples of that here in Glastonbury. I live in this bonkers town, which is full of people with many different beliefs and practices. And I think it was a couple of years ago now, there was a man from Dundee in the north of Scotland, north of the country, who heard voices that told him that he would stop hearing the voices if he killed somebody here. And he travelled 500 miles and stabbed a pensioner to death. So this is not the only example of things like that that's happened here. So I think it'd be fascinating if somebody did a study on these kinds of experiences that people have. But back to your comment about Hecate, of course, the practice of theurgy was very popular amongst her ancient devotees, especially as the world went into like Neoplatonism and coming out of the Chaldean oracles, for example. So the point of theurgic rituals is to embody the deity, but it's not becoming the deity permanently. So I think experiences like that, I've done a lot of oracular trance work, possession work, whatever you want to call it. And the theory with like the more theurgic work side of that is that a little bit of the deity remains within you, or you become a little bit more like the deity. I'm not sure which side of the belief I'm entirely on. Every time you do these practices, because the practices are quite involved, they involve purification, devotion. It's not the same as like the conjurations that you find in things that we talked about earlier, like the Key of Solomon or the Goetia, where you kind of conjure your spirit and you're holding it with a sword or something under some kind of threat of punishment within the triangle outside of the circle, or within something. It is actually bringing the deity inside of yourself. So you've got to prepare yourself as a vessel for that. And as I kind of think, I wrote, I think while David was talking, I wrote a little thing in saying, in essence, I think within the Western traditions, we lack a structure for these things to happen in. I was actually having a conversation this past weekend with somebody about this very thing. Traditions from the pagan traditions and Wicca and these things have influenced the development of Western magic, and it's great. It's been at the forefront of its revival, but it's also had a negative effect because in Wicca, for example, the concept of devotion isn't the same as what you find in more established traditions. Let's just put it that way. There's no idea of like creating shrines or vessels or actually, the offerings that we've been talking about, for example, it's very ethereal. It's just like the leftover wine and half a cookie or something that is chucked out at a tree or something. It's more like disposing of it. It's one of the key issues I've had with, I was initiated into that tradition when I was quite young, and I've kind of come out of it and kind of gone back into it in a very different way, because I think this link to devotion and purification and preparation, yes, it takes a long time, but it is how you get results. You don't get results from just doing, you can get results from theatre and from just, I don't know, imagination, like there's a big thing in kind of the more new age and pagan traditions of creative or guided visualizations, and they're great teaching tools, but they're not a kind of substitute for experiencing the deities. So I think what you are talking about is a form of theurgy. So if you've not looked into that, that might be something for you to go and, I don't know, explore.
If I may interrupt you. Yes, I have. I have been studying the Vajrayana tradition since the early 90s, and I've tried to how would you say that? To merge the Vajrayana tradition with Hecate, and to merge the Vajrayogini sadhana together with Hecate work, to give it a proper grounding, and to do the self-generation as a goddess, which is the Kierim in the Tibetan tradition, and the Dzogchen, so it's the generation stage and the completion stage yoga in the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, you know, together to complete this embodiment within. So yes, I have some idea of how to complete this embodiment and in a theurgical framework. And my problem with the Western tradition is that they actually do not have the proper framework to contain this. They really don't. They have spells and they have spell work and they have rhymes, but they don't have the energetic work. They don't have the proper framework to really encapsulate it. They really don't.
I hope we can see your work published soon, Naomi.
Yes.
I very much enjoyed reviewing it. It's substantial study of the application of Vajrayana to traditional Hecate worship.
Naomi, that does sound really, really fascinating. So I didn't know that you were writing on it, but I'd love to read it as well. I have spent quite a lot of time around Buddhism in the last decade or so, and I've spent time in India, traveling and, you know, experiencing quite a lot of things. So that would be fascinating.
I love your work. I'd love to compare notes.
It'd be very, very interesting.
Can I ask a question? How do you currently navigate it with your patients? Because it's a very delicate line to tread of listening, of showing empathy, of believing what they're saying, and obviously stopping them from harming themselves. So what do you do now?
This is a multi-layered question because I'm both a spiritual practitioner and I am like, how do you say, I work in healthcare, you know? And then I have to put on my healthcare face, you know, and I have to be more objective and have to use my best practices as is used in the healthcare system in the Netherlands, you know, and I can't stray from these practices because I will lose my license to practice, you know. So within these, rail guards, I try to do my best. This is the honest answer, and what really happens is when I work with psychotic patients, I try to vibe with them. I love them. This is my work. I try to get inside their experience. Sometimes I do experience what they experience. Sometimes I view what they view. Sometimes I see the entities that tell them to kill themselves. And I know who these entities are.
Wow.
But I am not allowed to validate that at the same time. You know, that's problematic from a mental health care perspective. So I can't do that. I can prescribe medication. I can give cognitive behavioral therapy. I can give like information on psychosis and all these kinds of things. So from that framework, I can work. And from these limits, I have to operate, you know, and I can do that. But
can the patient see that you see at least?
So, actually, yes, but that's an intuitive process, and what I feel and what often happens is that they intuitively trust me, and that makes me happy, and that keeps me doing my job. Actually, so you know that is yeah.
Well, that's amazing, good work. Anybody else? Arshan? Mysterious Arshan?
Yes, I do have a question. Thanks for having me. So, I had questions regarding contacting entities. Five really specific questions. So, if anyone has been able to contact the same entity or the same type of entity repeatedly through a ritual, So, which means if they're able to repeat this experience. So, how do they, first of all, differentiate their inner thoughts and projections with an external being, communication with an external being, or at least partially external, given the communication is somehow done through the brain, right? So it can't be fully external. So, and the second question is what is the method to know there's an established mutual connection? So let's say in our day-to-day activities, we have a communication protocol. Like we know someone is talking to us and we are talking to them. But how do they establish that type of communication, like as saying like the connection is established? So in our conscious lives, one thing that is so different from the altered state is it's shared. You can always ask a peer that, do you see the same thing? Like, do you believe in the same thing? But when it becomes a little bit individualistic in some form of altered state, it becomes a little bit difficult.
Right.
My third question is, what is the language?
Can we stick
Yes.
it to two for the time being?
Yes. Okay.
And I'm glad that David's got his hand up because I was going to ask him. So, David. Oh, you're muted, David.
Mm-hmm.
You're muted, David. You need to unmute yourself.
All right. Sorry. I'm from the older generation. Yeah. So I was going to say something, comment on Naomi quickly, but let's do the other first, because that is also something, of course, which is interesting to me as someone who is involved with Haitian voodoo. We do frequently, of course, contact the same entities all the time or very regularly. And there is a certain, of course, in Haitian voodoo, you have the full possession. So spirits are called in. There is a technology with which to call the spirits in. Then possession happens, and these possessions are often public. So the spirits show a certain character. They show certain personality traits and speak certain language and have a very distinct way of interacting. And this cannot really be faked. So it's very easy for an audience of experienced voodooists to understand or experience whether an entity is really down or not. And there are various other ways for a priest, for example, to contact spirits so that the full possession doesn't happen, but there is a communication possible. So let's say the spirit, the priest wants to employ the spirit to help somebody in an endeavor. So, there are various ways then to deal with the spirit. The spirit sometimes answers through divination. Sometimes they answer through like a more mental contact. However, there is a modus operandi that you learn through which you establish that contact, and it's a process of learning which you have to go through in order to make sure that this kind of establishing actually functions really well. Some have, and every priest and every specialist after a while basically also has their specific ways which work better for them than others. Some do divination with cards, some do other types of divination, some use other methods easier than others. So, however, this is all taught within a traditional framework, tried and tested. And a lot of things need to align for those things that you've mentioned very correctly to be basically to be accounted for, so that they don't disturb the process or that they don't cloud the contact or however you want to say it. So yeah, so that's that. And now I have to remember what I wanted to say in
Well,
regards.
I was just going to ask you, just a little add-on, because you made me think of it, is where do trickster entities fit into that?
Well, the trickster entities, are not so much that they trick you all the time. So, they're not tricking you. Well, trickster entities, they have a certain character and a certain function. So, I guess, even Hermes would be considered a trickster entity. So trickster entities, I guess, I don't know exactly if that wouldn't detour us too much now, but these are very fun and often interesting entities to deal with, but they're also sometimes hard to tie down to coherent ways of communication. Let's put it this way. And I think anything else would be now too specific, at least from my perspective, what that's concerned. Unless there's a specific question that goes into that. But just quickly before I forget that I wanted to, I don't know if I can add anything to Sorita because she said everything very clearly. But I just wanted to just say that from my own experience, even from the interpretation of ancient Greece, there were people sometimes so fully called, I guess, by an entity, whether it's I don't know, a warrior being called by Ares or something that, I always think, even when I read the Greek myth and so on, an entity, a god or a goddess basically casts an entire world. So, we always have the idea we have all these gods and we deal with all these gods and, we have to keep a hierarchy. So I guess if a warrior is called by a certain god, his entire world is colored by the experience of standing under the sway of that particular deity. So a warrior's life under, let's say Ares, for example, so everything in his life would be colored by that sway of that god, his love life, his life in his civil life, especially, of course, his life as a warrior. So the same would be, I guess, true for Hecate, someone who is strongly called and gets under the sway of that goddess and lives a life accordingly. Unfortunately, today, like Sorita said, we lack the framework where the gods are considered real and where the gods have a place in our cosmology. So, of course, it's very hard, like Naomi said, it's very hard to find ways in which such a sway can find its expression properly and could be nurtured properly. In Voodoo, something similar is happening. In other Afrocentric traditions, some people say, "Oh, I'm a child of Ogun," god of war and iron and stuff. Or in Voodoo, we have a head spirit and an escort, an entourage that kind of, has a strong sway over our lives and colors many things that we do. And there's a cultic framework which allows us to kind of establish our lives with and around these kinds of presences which strongly influence who we are, and which goes very, very much hand in hand with the porous self, which we have spoken about before. Without that, it's very difficult to even establish a proper relationship. And one of the things that happen during Voodoo initiations, especially a little higher initiation, it's literally your head is being prepared with very, very complex rituals to actually be able to contain this head spirit and others into your spiritual organism. An unprepared person would literally shatter and go probably insane if these stronger forms of contact would be attempted even. That is why people who undergo dreams and very strong signs that they're being called, and sometimes it's like a torment, right? The spirits want something from them, they press themselves upon them, and they do not know what to do about it. So they don't have the framework, the ways in which to contain that sway, that pressure, that powerful influx. And these people then go to the voodoo priest or to the specialists and tell them about it, and then maybe initiations need to be done to certain degrees or to a certain form, or sometimes you have to marry a spirit in very different ways that could be used or established to make the contact authentic and mutually beneficial, you could say, because that's what it's all about in the end.
Okay.
I believe the cultus is born from the way the individual and the community responds to the world, and how that relationship works. The mutual beneficial relationship between the living and the dead, and the living and the phenomenal universe, that has to be a place of a constant let's a constant interaction and a constant way of making it work. And the cultus is the way where this happens. A way in which individual and world, community and world, individual and community all come together in that big heroes gamos of the world, which is not always pleasurable, fun, and full of light. It can also be quite trying, I guess.
Okay. And if you don't mind me asking like one very specific question, let's say you do the initiation and you create a medium through sound that it becomes the medium to connect with some beings, right? So let's say through that, how do you feel? Do you feel some of these entities being confined, or their presence is distributed? So do you have a feeling like the characteristics of that you mentioned, like can you feel if they're confined, like a well-defined species, for instance, like humans? You can know exactly where human boundaries are, right? So but do you feel some of the entities might be present everywhere, and some others might be confined?
Confined to a certain place or to a certain dimension, or what do you mean? I'm not sure if
I don't know exactly how to put this into words, but confined within a certain not the dimension as the dimensions we experience during our day-to-day non-altered state. But there is a very specific feeling that something is confined and something is present everywhere.
Well, I guess so. I mean, in the sense that I think there's, for example, a Genius Loci, a spirit that is maybe confined to a certain landscape. And I also believe that I would even go so far as to say the spirit that we encounter in a moment is never going to be exactly the same as we encounter the next day. Even the spirits that I mentioned before, even a great spirit like Hecate, my experience of Hecate that I have today will not be exactly the same that I'll have tomorrow. It's going to be a Hecatean experience, but just as me, like David Beth today that you encounter today will be a very different David Beth that you encounter tomorrow. Even my molecules will be different. So I think everything in the world is in constant change. But of course, let's say the spirit of a landscape. If I stand in front of a valley, I see a river and I see the forest and the clouds and the way the light shines, and I'm lost in that enthusing moment. It impacts on me in some way that I cannot recapture another day. However, that valley, in one way or another, if it's still there, will still have the quality of the valley in a sense. However, it will always be different. So I try to move away from any reductionism in a sense. However, I do believe there are things you can encounter everywhere. For example, of course, you could invoke or evoke or encounter certain spirits in other places. Like, I don't know, a spirit like Ursuli, like a goddess of Ursuli Freda, goddess of love and beauty, and so forth. She'll appear anywhere. Like any voodoo spirit that I can encounter in Haiti, I can encounter in Germany if the methodology is used to bring them down. But you know, every time there will be slightly different, probably related to place. And you mentioned sound, I guess, right? Did I hear
Yes,
this
that's
correct?
right.
Sounds interesting. Sound is very important to voodoo. I mean,
Mhm.
there's no voodoo ceremony, especially public, where there's no drums and no sound. Like the sound patterns, also they are ritual. Their ritual language, which is
Mm.
employed to call down certain spirits. Every spirit has their own drum sounds and their own songs and their own
Mm.
rhythms. And these are designed to connect to the spirits in a specific way. So,
If I can be more specific, when I say sound, that this is like a very personal. So I refer to voice, nasal passage sounds, and throat sounds, as well as resonance inside, like the like a mouth and the throat.
well, it's interesting
That's
because, like in voodoo, not only
Mhm.
is music or even voice, of course, singing used
Mhm.
to bring the spirits down, to prepare the stage for the spirits to be able to manifest. So there are specific ritual songs that are sung for each spirit. However, the spirits themselves oftentimes speak in very strange voices. There are, for example, powerful voodoo spirits who do not have human sound because either their tongues were cut out, because there are, let's say, spirits that go back to mutilated slaves that fought in revolutionary circumstances or something, and then they were mutilated, and now they only do really guttural sounds. And so when they come in
Mhm.
possession, they have these very, very strange noises. Some even have no human voices. They hiss like snakes and stuff like that. So these spirits manifest not only as sound, but through sound. But I would go personally, I would go as so far as to say every sound also is a spirit. Like every word even is the word is the body of the soul that manifests through it. So, and the soul is for me the daemon. So a sound, and that is why we can create, let's say, ritual or magical language. Because if we know how to kind of like put sounds together, these sounds, when they're put together, create a body of an entity. And that has been something that is also very important to me. I actually even write about this in the book I mentioned before, I just released last week. So
That's something that I'm really interested in because I think our given names are a spell for our lives, and we actually have a whole kind of matrix of meaning within our names that often ends up predicting our life, our character, so many things about who we end up becoming because we're given this magical spell when we're first born. And then, you mentioned about knowing the right things to get the right qualities and being cultured in a particular environment. And in a lot of Orthodox countries, you have name days rather than birthdays. And people born on a saint's day will be given that name, and they do tend to be in that kind of saint, what would you call it, like egregore of some sort. So they start to have those kind of qualities, or something about their life tends to reflect back the qualities of that saint to them. So I think the idea of words, I think words are the most ever present technology, ritual technology that we have. And you certainly can see now how we're in kind of propaganda wars, and how powerful words are, and how powerful words are to sell us utter crud for no reason, and to convince us of how to feel, and to program us to feel in a particular way. So that's an interesting point. Thank you very much. Sarita, last comments with you, and then we'll close up because I am desperate to go for a wee, actually.
Me? Okay. Well, I mean, I've been listening to, oh, sorry, I had my hand up. I didn't do that on purpose. But I have been listening to you, and I think right knowledge joined to, like listening to David and you, and my brain is kind of, spinning off, because this is my first time in this group, and obviously I'm not familiar with the format here, and I've really been enjoying it. But what comes to my mind is that to know the right things, to cultivate the right qualities, to create the conditions which makes results possible is possibly what we need. You know, we were talking about Western and non-Western things earlier. And I think, you know, there are things that we can learn, and we can just create these conditions in which results do become possible, for those of us that are interested, obviously, in conjuring and all that. And you know, I want to say something profound, but I didn't know that I was going to be speaking. But I think, you know, the other thing that comes to my mind is that living traditions, you know, David was talking about voodoo, but also candomblé and kimbanda, and, you know, all these kind of traditions that they're not pure, you know, they have evolved into different kind of landscapes, into different places. And I think one of the difficulties that we have within the kind of Western landscape when it comes to these spirits, and my friend Emily Carding wrote an article, for example, about fairies and aliens, which I was thinking about when Susan was talking about how the experiences that people describe and even the way they look can sometimes be very, very similar. But again, it's about this lack of like a shared language, a shared system. And, you know, I think for the modern West, maybe the task is not appropriating these things, this kind of lure of the exotic that I think David was touching on earlier, where things from other parts of the world is always so much more interesting. You know, it's like, oh, wow, you know, you did something. When I come back from Brazil and I come to the UK, everybody always thinks, oh gosh, you know, she's been off doing, you know, these Africa, you know, this kind of candomblé or kimbanda or something. But I go to Brazil, my Brazilian friends have all left kimbanda and candomblé to kind of start doing Western paganism or Wicca or something like that, because it's this kind of mutual kind of interest in the opposite of what we've got. So maybe for the modern West, it's not like appropriation, but the repair of the systems that we still have by looking and studying the kind of traditions that have evolved and has, you know, created systems for us to still learn through, and kind of finding a mutual language through which we can kind of, I don't know, I've got a big interest. I did years ago, just for fun, I did a BA in religious studies when my son was little. And, you know, I kind of developed this kind of really deep interest in these kind of ritual technologies, for lack of a better term, that is in common across different cultures, you know. So whether it's, you know, offerings, invocation, purification, possession, processions, trance music, feasting, you know, sacred exchanges of some sort. And I think what matters not is like trying to reconstruct a past, which there's been a very romantic view of that in the West over the last, I don't know, 100, 150 years, where people have been trying to reinvent something. We don't need to reinvent it. There are actually technologies and there are rituals, and it's just that it might not be what we want it to be. But I think we can restore those structures and, you know, find a kind of profound devotion that is intelligible, that's alive within the Western world. And sometimes with spirits from elsewhere, you know, the spirits do travel. You know, I don't know, like I live in Somerset, and there were temples here to Roman gods, you know. So if that's possible, and we say, hey, they've got a history here, then so does the gods that we bring here now. And, you know, the gods that we travel with around the world, it's something that people have done for a very long time. So some spirits, again, you know, is tied to landscapes, but not all of them. I think this is a fantastic group. I'm waffling on. I could waffle on all night about all kinds of things. David really knows how to kind of like wind me up. Can I just say that it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful quality. So I'd love to come back if you do this again. Let me know how I find out.
Great, I will.
And I promise I won't waffle this much in future. I actually know what is expected of me.
The next two topics that I've got planned, but I don't have dates for them yet because I'm waiting to hear who's available, are the psyop, which I think is quite appropriate right now. And one thing that I am extremely passionate about is beauty and the effect of beauty on the soul and on humanity in general. And I would love to have people come back to talk about that. Myron, you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to leave us with a light and love, positive, like auspicious entity encounter message before we go?
No, I just think that what everybody said and everybody discussed is so wonderfully interesting, and I love all the information that these people, have, and I've studied those books and voodoo especially, and I just think it's wonderful that this is available to human consciousness, all of this. That's all I want to say about it. And that you bring programs like this so people can actually exchange ideas, because it's so rare to be able to do that. You can't do it in your church. You can't do it in your synagogue. Where are you going to do it?
I think it's really important in this current climate. I watched, because I was doing some research about the PSYOPs, and I watched this great interview with this guy who specializes in PSYOPs. And he was saying that the most important thing we need to do, and I think it's true in pretty much everything, is we must hold on to our humanity and cultivate relationships with living things. And I've always thought the best thing that any human being could do is be a gardener and cultivate positive, mutually respectful relationships. And we shouldn't be drawn into division, and we should talk to everyone and try to understand their point of view. And so that's what I want to do.
It's very hard with AI and all of that coming, and robots and robotics and all of that other culture that is going to be very dynamic. There's no question about it. To hang on to the fundamentals, of the dimensions that we've been talking about all.
I think this is the thing as well, like the more relationships we have with living things, and they can be human and non-human, I think gardening is like the best spiritual act you can do, because you're cultivating living things and you form relationships and you understand the subtlety of how plants have a spirit and how animals have a spirit, and how by cultivating plants in a plot, you're attracting animal spirits and bird spirits, and you're amplifying the spirit potential of any space. And I think we should really, go out and do that, perhaps rather than looking at World War III unfolding. And
Rama used to work in his garden, and people would come to him and say, "Oh, you're Ramakrishna," and he'd go, "No, I just work here on this garden." He would not reveal himself to these people. He was just saying, "No, I'm just working in my garden."
I think
that's the magic of that power.
Nothing better than that. So I'll wish you all farewell this afternoon, this evening actually it is now. We started this afternoon. And I hope you all have very auspicious entity encounters. And I'll see you next time. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks so much for the panel.
Thank you, sir.
Amazing.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.